Welcome to the assessment workshops at North Carolina Central University. This is going to be an overview of critical assessments in visual impairments. The presentation has been a preparation kind of post-COVID to address some of the needs we had in not seeing students in districts having gaps in the student services and assessment that they may have had, and also to meet the need of our students who are going through assessment training through their classes, to get a more collaborative, holistic view of the assessment process. I'm Sean Takun. I am the head of the Teachers of Students with Visual Impairments Training and Assistive Technology Training here at North Carolina Central University. These slides have been contributed to as well by Jennifer Thurman, who leads up our O&M side. And with me, I have
Joseph Green. I am a teacher of the visually impaired and orientation and mobility specialist, and I provide services pretty much throughout the state of North Carolina.
And your interesting fact about your presenters is, I think, if I remember correctly, Joe, we graduated right around the same time in like 04?
Yes. Yep, that's correct.
Back in 04, when I was a young man. So, collectively between the two of us, we're both O&M and TSVI, and I'm a CADIS, and Joe is working to become one. We've got about 30 years of experience in the field when it comes to assessment, and found that in those times we had a lot of shared philosophies and approaches, and we just kind of wanted to share it in a holistic way for you guys. So this first workshop is going to cover the assessments we're going to talk about from a broad view. And then there are going to be follow-up workshops that are going to be done synchronously next Saturday to give a more in-detailed steps of what you do, how you do it, of each of these assessments. So this presentation is intended to be a broad overview so that we can look at the interconnectedness of assessments and opportunities for collaboration. And I'll hand it over to you, Joe.
Okay. So first we wanted to talk about what are the required assessments in North Carolina and the process for them. First and most important is when you receive an initial referral, a functional vision evaluation and learning media assessment is required to determine eligibility. It is also required on a 3-year re-eval. The ECC is not required but is considered best practice. Orientation and mobility assessments are also not required, but they really should be done if you have a student that has a visual impairment, because we can't always determine just by somebody saying, oh, that child gets around fine, that means that they do not have issues with how their visual impairment affects their ability to move. A lot of times the person that's saying they're fine is looking in only that one setting, like the classroom. They're not considering how the child does in unfamiliar environments or with change in lighting or any of those kind of things. I always recommend that you make sure that when you are doing an initial evaluation that you are also following your local LEA in terms of their timeline. There are obvious timelines available, or that are required rather, from IDEA, but your LMA or your LEA rather might want to push up a timeline based on the needs of the students. So you want to be aware of that. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to kind of, now that I look at these, I think that, we probably should have put ECC at the end. We were kind of going through this list and labeling out what would be roles of a TSVI and what would be the roles of an O&M. But when you really look at the expanded core curriculum, it ties into everything. O&M is part of the expanded core curriculum. Your compensatory skills are established in that. The ECC, although it's not required, and we say best practices, really what it's going to do is inform that present level of functioning, and it's going to be something that you come back to constantly, and you're continually assessing it and adding information in there while all those compensatory skills are being improved over time. You'll see when we go through on the later slides that there's some like additional tie-ins that sort of are all over the place.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to kind of mention here is whenever you look at DPI, say under the area of orientation and mobility, they have a assessment tool and they have a screening tool. As Joe was just saying, we always want our VI students to receive an O&M assessment. Like if an O&M assessment is possible, like purposeful, independent, and safe movement is just good for kids. And there are those two tools on the DPI site, but I wanted to take a moment to differentiate. A screening tool is for everyone. Anyone can screen a kid using a checklist of identifying skills or whatnot, and based upon your knowledge and area, your screening may be a little more informed or not. But screening tools are kind of intended for anyone to pick up, and screening tools lead us to referrals. They give us checklists of things that lead to referrals. Once you get to a referral, then you have an O&M assessment. And O&M assessments are not for everyone. O&M assessments are for certified orientation mobility specialists to conduct. And I just wanted to kind of differentiate those two.
Okay.
Anything more from this slide?
No,
Got kind of interrupted there.
The next, no, we're good. I think we're good to go to the next slide.
All right, all you.
And at this moment, I just wanted to interject on a diagnostic teaching. And it ties into what we'll talk about later when it comes into the discussion further about functional vision evaluation and learning, media learning assessment. Oh boy, I'm putting them all backwards today. Sorry, folks. Diagnostic teaching in this context means diagnosing how a student is doing with instruction, the level of instruction that you're providing, how material is presented, the level of frustration that the student shows, and making adjustments to instruction to best serve the needs of the student. The reason I bring this up here is because in my philosophy, I don't need to get every piece of information about how a student's using their functional vision evaluation during, or using their functional vision rather, during the evaluation process. I'm looking more for what are the aspects of their visual impairment that is making it obvious to me that they are eligible for services. Once I start working with the student, I may determine that there's some more things that are an area of concern, but the student is now already qualified, and now it's more about me making sure that if the student has issues with contrast, that I'm letting the teaching staff know that I'm looking at the materials that are being presented to the student and helping them make adjustments to them. So all of those things are areas that you are unfolding as you're working through the education of this student. And if you find that there's an accommodation that was not made on the initial IEP, you can always go back and add that. So just consider that when you are doing the functional vision evaluation, your primary concern is to determine if the student is eligible to receive services and to allow it to begin to inform the beginning of instruction.
I think that's a really good point, because we talk a lot about our assessments and we go into all the details of all the information that we kind of need to do really comprehensive or really make well-informed decisions. But that goes really well beyond the requirements of determining that a student is eligible. And in terms of the diagnostic and continued work, I always like to share that, I had a student that was, in the 10th grade, had been identified as NLP, no light perception, since birth, probably. And it wasn't until his 10th grade year that I caught him using light perception to actually avoid obstacles without the aid of his cane. And so it had gone. I mean, this kid had really snowed people for about 16 years. And knowing him, I think intentionally snowed people. That he had, everyone believed he had no residual vision. And he was clever enough to know that that was an asset. And so that continued assessment can inform us over time. And it's just good for us to always be reflecting and diagnosing and collecting more data as we're working with students. It's always a good idea.
So that's interesting that you mentioned that, because obviously, well, actually, it should be obvious that, and I will say this later, that the only time that we're technically not required to do a functional vision evaluation is in the case of anophthalmia. So the student that you're talking about probably was assessed several times, every 3 years, and he might have hidden that fact, as you said, but the only way that you really knew that he had some functional vision is because you happened to notice him using it. So at that point, that would be a good time to say, okay, now we have to do a functional vision evaluation and really determine the extent of your residual vision and how it helps. So the point being is that it didn't come out through the assessment process, it came out through the diagnostic teaching.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But let's look at that assessment process here. Moving into the FVA and LMA,
Yes.
or whatever combination of those letters, potentially using the letter E as well for evaluation,
Yes.
that we use in our field.
I do tend to use the FVE more than the FVA, but it is listed in ECATS now as an FVA. So I'm trying to use the correct language. So when it comes
the term assessment in the field of education informally refers to a specific published tool, an actual assessment tool and diagnostic. And since we really don't technically have a named assessment tool, you're probably right with the FEE, but there's so many terminologies that we use that it's just not worth that uphill battle.
Sure. So as I said earlier, the functional vision assessment is required for eligibility determination and for services. So we're looking at visual competencies, visual skills, the preferred environmental cues. We're assessing the, just the overall impact of the child's visual impairment on their ability to access the general curriculum. It also gives us a starting point for consideration of instruction. When you have a brand new student that you're initially evaluating, you want to get enough information to be able to write some IEP goals, think about the level of services that you're going to be providing, thinking about accommodations, etc. The learning media assessment is also a required assessment for initial evaluation, and it directs the instructional method. Are you going to be pursuing instruction that includes braille instruction or other braille and or tactile materials? Or does the student have sufficient vision to access print, but you know that they're going to need magnification of print or additional lighting? Maybe they do better with hard copy paper as opposed to using a computer screen. So it informs us of the ordering of mediums. Theoretically, all of us use multiple mediums for learning. For most of us, our primary learning medium is vision. We also learn through auditory information that we receive as we're listening to the teacher while we're looking at the materials. And we use our tactile senses. I say, when I reach into my pocket, I don't need to see my pen, I just need to feel for it. So we use tactual information. But for some students, tactual information may be their primary learning medium. So this also helps with instructional formatting and the potential skills to maximize comprehension. Now, let me just add in, it's always best to get as much information from the beginning as possible. You really want to make sure that you have an eye report that gives the official diagnosis, that gives the visual acuity, that gives the prognosis. And I've found in my work that I've had parents start to give me information, and then once I receive the eye report, I find out that they had misunderstood the visual impairment, or they had said one thing that was different than the doctor said. So you really want to try and not begin the functional vision assessment process without an eye report. It is also good to interview the parent or guardian. Sometimes they will give you a lot of information. If they are particularly concerned about their child's vision, you're going to hear everything that is a problem for them. But sometimes they might be aloof to how their child's vision affects them, and you're going to find that you will need to inform them more precisely when you provide the results of your assessment. You should also interview the teacher or other service providers if this is a student that's new to you but not new to them. Very often they will be the people that will say, oh my gosh, this kid, they hold the book 2 inches from their face. They are always running into things, so that's really good information to garner. And when you're writing your assessment, you want to say, in an interview with so-and-so, they describe the following situations. If there is a previous FVA or LMA, you might have to decide if you want to receive or read it before or after the one you conduct. I tend to want to see it after, so I'm not persuaded by the content, because not everybody does them the same way. And I've had functional vision evaluations that have come from different states where maybe their standards are a little bit less, and I get a lot of misinformation, or I get a lot of the teacher's interpretation as opposed to more objective data. So that's something that you just need to consider.
Yeah,
When
and
it
I'm
comes,
actually kind of the opposite in that I always like to read it before, but then
there you go.
my intrinsic approach to everything is as a constant skeptic. I'm always questioning everything. So more often than not, I'm questioning every little detail of what I'm reading there. So that's just kind of my default mathematician, did you prove it kind of thing. But yeah, everyone needs to find that out for themselves. And I really like what you shared about parents. Parents are a really mixed bag when it comes to this profession. Parents are the greatest asset, the greatest team leader, and can sometimes be the most challenging detractor from student success. And it's really important that we learn how to work with them to get the information we need, and at the same time keep our potentially views of their parenting or level of concern or anything else kind of to ourselves, because that can spoil a situation where we can create a really nice collaborative relationship. And although the emphasis of this assessment workshop is collaborative assessment between O&M and TSVI, it bears saying that parents are a huge collaborator in what we do. So
Yes, and let me just add, I've always said in education that the biggest variable to a student's ability to learn and get the most out of the curriculum is the parent. So, so I'm glad that you said all of those things.
yeah, all right.
Okay, so now the learning media assessment can be included and branches out from the functional vision assessment. Uh, a TVI may combine the two assessments into one FVA LMA. So you can have a separate document that is strictly the learning media assessment, or you can combine the two. In recent times, I've tended to combine the two because they are both implicit in the eligibility process. So what we're really looking for in an LMA is the primary and secondary media preference. As I discussed earlier, are they primarily a print user, strictly a print user, primarily a print user, or are they somebody who learns best through auditory information, especially in the case of kids with multiple impairments? Or are they a tactual learner where their primary learning medium needs to be stuff they can put their fingers on, whether it's braille or tactile graphics? Now, I want everyone to understand this, that under IDEA law, all students identified with a visual impairment are entitled to braille instruction as part of their learning process. The IEP team may determine braille instruction is not warranted based on the results of the LMA. So when you look at the special factors page in the IEP, you can't just say yes or no to the question of braille. You need to put a clarifying statement on there that says something like, John has a visual acuity of 2200, a stable prognosis of vision, and has demonstrated through the learning media assessment that he is a print user with minor magnification. That's really what they want to see in that spot in special factors.
So, Joe, because you've seen inside ECATS, and I've seen what's been published, and I never know if I have an accurate view. But I do know, like you, a bunch of other states. So
Yes.
both in Illinois and Iowa, all students that had a visual impairment, you had to check yes or no on that box if they had a visual impairment. And if you checked no for braille instruction, you had to give a qualifying statement.
Correct.
Otherwise, it was considered like a sort of illegitimate choice, and it was going to leave you open to, potential future, due process or other things. Is that same here? Is there a
Yes,
line for
yes,
that?
yes, yes. That's exactly what I'm saying. I've seen on, and it is true in other states, especially in the north, they do have a two-part box there. Or is the child visually impaired? Yes. Are they in need of braille instruction? No. But you have to give a clarifying statement. And I've seen IEPs where it just says, it'll say no to the question of braille, and then it'll say the student is a print user. Well, no, you need to explain why.
Right.
Okay. You want to put their visual acuity. You want to put that they were assessed using print, and that they, that their prognosis is stable. So
And
I just recommend put more information there than less. Because
and
if it
I
was
just want to
audited, they asked that question, that's something that you would, you know, have to respond to. Go ahead, Sean.
And I just want to, we're not belaboring this because it's a non-minor issue. It's mainly for, in a world where parents are seeking due process and are seeking, are challenging IEPs and school district decisions, which I've heard locally within the Triangle, there's a bit more of that going on.
Mm-hmm.
This is your insuring yourself professionally from any
Yes.
potential, liability on you made the call and the district's going to go, I don't know, that's what the VI teacher said. We really want to make sure that we're tagging our bases, and you'll hear a little bit more about tagging your bases in the ECC area. Sorry, I'll let you jump back in there.
No, that's great. And actually, you make a really good point, because I have had parents that insist on Braille instruction, and you have the learning media assessment and the I report that states, when you combine the two, the child is not in need of Braille instruction. And also, I've seen I even hate to say this, I've seen people, like I belong to a TBI Facebook group, and I've seen TBIs, say, well, the student has 2200 vision, but the parent wants me to teach Braille just in case. Well, if we use that as our qualifier for who should receive Braille, then we should all be reading Braille just in case. So
I
this
mean, that's why I
this
got my degree.
yeah. I might as well just teach the whole class of students that I'm facing, when I am with my visually impaired student, because just in case any one of them could lose their vision. Well, no, we don't want to do it that way. We want to really honor the needs of the student. And if the student is in need of Braille instruction, then they should get Braille instruction. Likewise, if they've demonstrated in every way that they are a print reader, then we should give them print and not spend time on something that's not really particularly effective for them. And then, and I think you added this statement, but I'm going to read it, and we'll talk about this too, Sean. For difficult to assess students, this may involve painstaking observation of sensory engagement.
Yeah,
So this, oh, go ahead.
I can give a real, I think, key example on that. And back when I first started in the field, I had a CVI kid, and this was certainly when CVI was just starting to be labeled and applied back in 2005. No question. I had a lot of CVI kids in rural Iowa. There was something in the fertilizer. I don't know. But this student would not visually engage everything. And when I was doing my LMA with that student, one of the things I noticed was their constant seeking out of tactual stimulation. So the student was always either feeling the tread on the bottom of her shoes or her shoelaces, or seeking out other students' shoelaces. The student was constantly seeking out tactile stimulation. And I had to sit in that room for probably 2 sessions of 30 to 40 minutes, just watching the class, not interacting with the student at all, and just taking that LMA sheet where you write down on the line, what was the activity? Was it visual, auditory, or tactile? And
Yes.
just doing that every minute for 30 minutes, 2 times, before I looked back at the data and I saw, okay, this is a tactile student. Everyone's like, but she won't keep her hands on Braille. I'm like, whether or not the student's Braille reader and whether or not the student's a tactile learner are 2 different topics. And so
Yes.
sometimes to do this LMA is going to take a lot of really objective sitting there and just watching the kid. A few people in class have heard about one of my students who, was in a gurney, and it wasn't until I observed her at a lunch hour that I noticed how auditorily engaged she was to the gossip of her assistants. So, yeah.
I'm really glad that you said that, because I'm glad that you basically dissected what we mean by tactual learner. We're not just talking about braille. You can have a student who is not, and I'm just going to say this, intellectually capable of reading braille, but they can benefit from tactual instruction using materials, things like a 3D object schedule, pictures that are tactilely represented of a bird or a leaf or any of those kind of things. So we want to really understand that we're not just talking about braille here. We are talking about tactual learner, and for some of those students, their primary learning medium may still be auditory, but they are also would benefit from tactual instruction. The other thing that I wanted to say is observation in a classroom setting for this can be extremely useful because the situation is not contrived and it allows you to see the student interacting with everyday material, which is basically what you just said, Sean. When you're talking about that student that was seeking out tactual stimuli. You couldn't have seen that if you were trying to contrive that situation.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And
you were going to add
the
something
one
there?
thing, and I'll just kind of or pin this one up there, that whenever we're talking learning media assessment, increasingly our education materials are being provided in a digital media format. But I'll tag on that a little more when we get to the ECC stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that. That's going to be really important moving forward. Okay, so the functional vision assessment, and I copied the IDEA definition of visual impairment because I want us to be really clear about it. So visual impairment, including blindness, means an impairment in vision that, even with correction, adversely affects a child's educational performance. The term means both partial sight and blindness. Now, there was a letter that went out, I believe it was in 2017, from the Department of Education because states had further defined visual impairment, including like a visual acuity or something akin to the legal definition of blindness. And it was there was a movement among a group of parents and other advocates who said, hey, you can't do that. We're looking at if the student is identified with a visual impairment, does it affect their educational performance? So if you get a referral for a child that has a visual impairment, even if their visual acuity is 20/70, you need to perform a functional vision assessment. You cannot make a determination based on an acuity if the student is eligible for services or not. This definition is the only acceptable definition of visual impairment that complies with IDEA law. I just already said what I said. I didn't read further into the slide. As I said earlier, the FEA is required for initial evaluations and reevaluations. It should also be conducted if a student's eye condition changes, including significant change in prescription, change in diagnosis, or change in prognosis. So in other words, if you have a student who has an eye surgery, and you may have just completed the functional vision assessment 6 months earlier, the student has an eye surgery and the eye doctor says, we were able to improve the vision in the right eye to 21/40. Well, then it is appropriate for you to reopen the eligibility process and say, you know what, I need to do another functional vision assessment on this child to determine if their change in vision affects their ability to access the educational material. Hopefully it will be for the better, but you really need to do that. Likewise, If you have a student who the prognosis has been stable and then all of a sudden they experience a significant loss in vision. I had that happen just a few years ago with a student in Orange County. For all the time that I'd worked with her, was about 2 years, she had like 2200, I think. And then all of a sudden, and even though her prognosis was, her actual diagnosis of visual impairment was an impairment that is typically stable, all of a sudden her visual acuity dropped to 21,000, and it did not change. It was a permanent drop, and rather scary for her and her parents, because she was looking at graduating high school within a few months, and she hadn't had any braille instruction because it just was not something that was necessary at the time. All of a sudden that changed, and we were able to get her significant instruction in assistive technology, and she moved from being a cane user to a dog guide. But those things do occur, so you want to be aware of that. And you want to make sure that you do a functional vision assessment when things like that happen. Now, according to the VI Praxis exam, the only time an FVA would not be completed is in the case of anophthalmia. That's an actual question on the Praxis exam. You probably have been prepared for that. But I would add, in the presence of prosthetic eyes. So anophthalmia means being born without a natural eye, but I've had students who had retinoblastoma, and within a few months of birth, their physical eyes are removed and they get prosthetic eyes. They would not be able to see anything. So you would not do a functional vision assessment in that case as well.
And to note on that, I'm sure that, for those people who are veteran teachers, if you ever want to just have a whole bunch of veteran teachers at a conference or something, tell funny stories, get into prosthetic eyes and the challenges of getting students to wear them. It is a never-ending wellspring. It's like asking math teachers about calculator use. It'll set a room on fire.
Right. Now, the other side of this, too, is like I had a student just a couple of years ago. He had a prosthetic eye in one eye, and his other eye, I think his visual acuity was listed at 2,800, and he had just a pinhole of visual field. But I did a functional vision evaluation on him, and, his vision was mostly useful for orientation and mobility, but he could, if he got close enough to some things, he could see like an outline of a picture or even some color or whatever. So if, regardless of the visual acuity, even if they say light perception, you really want to conduct a functional vision assessment to determine the extent to which any residual vision is useful in that child's education. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the expanded core curriculum.
Yep. And for those of you who have had me in class one way or another, this is probably a slide you're like, ugh, there's Takun's slide again. But I always put the expanded core curriculum up because just as a constant reminder that this is our work, right? This is what we are going to be working on. In the grand scheme of things, this is our primary identification of our domain of practice. And a lot of people struggle in visual impairments identifying our domain of practice. What's our job and what's not? This is it. And we don't have to do all of that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a pretty significant engagement of everything we do, and we're going to recruit people where we can. You'll already notice, though, that some of those areas of the FVA are already kind of implicitly addressed in what Joe has mentioned. So I break the expanded core curriculum up into 3 subcategories. Recently discovered that apparently DPI officially endorses that with a little graphic on their website. And the first area I call overcoming barriers. And as you will see, compensatory access really is determining how the student is going to access educational materials, which that really comes out of the LMA and the FEA. That's information that is drawing right out of there. And then those assessments are determining what we need to instruct, right? So we're not going to have to do an extra assessment, as it were, when it comes to compensatory access. The same thing is pretty much true about sensory efficiency. Hopefully a lot of that information came out of the learning media assessment. It draws from the individual student needs in that functional vision and learning media area. And we will need to write goals to improve the student's sensory efficiency, like auditory discrimination is a huge skill. Tactile discrimination and pre-braille skills is a huge skill. But I hope everyone sees that a good FEA LMA, where we've determined eligibility and we've identified the primary and secondary learning media, has pretty much set the stage for this. You've got enough information to begin working with the student, teaching them some compensatory skills, teaching them some improved sensory efficiency in what has emerged, and then a lot like what Joe shared, we're going to be able to do that diagnostic teaching to pull bigger pieces out. The same goes for assistive technology. That initial assessment is almost never going to include an assistive technology assessment. Generally, it could be referred in that initial scope of things, but once the student is determined eligible for vision services, then they're going to look at, we need to do an assessment for AT and identify some assistive technology tools that may help. Again, it's entirely student and task dependent on what's going on in the school, but the FEA and LMA determine what is inaccessible there. And that's going to dictate what we are going to use AT to compensate for. Really, AT points back to compensatory access and sensory efficiency with a tool that bridges that gap between what's kind of inaccessible and what is the student's preferred way of engaging it. So a lot of this overcoming barriers area in terms of assessment, if we've done our initial eligibility in FEA, LMA, we've already done all that. There isn't another distinct kind of set of assessments there. If you have access to an AT professional, either a CADIS or ATP, preferably a CADIS because I'm, opinionated, we're going to want to refer to them to do a really detailed AT assessment. But otherwise, we're trying to match a tool to what we've identified before. Moving into independent skills, which is that second category, you'll notice the first thing on the list here is orientation and mobility. So we'll deal with that in a moment. Leave that to the O&M. Like we mentioned at the very beginning, we can conduct a screening so that we can say, hey, I really think the student needs an O&M assessment or an O&M evaluation. For those of you that are duly certified, like Joe and I are, you're wearing two hats. And if you are officially retained by the district as a TSVI, you aren't to do an O&M assessment because that is not your job title or responsibilities. You can screen and refer. You can probably provide better information, but you probably shouldn't be doing the assessment. And you guys are all kind of going, well, why not? Why wouldn't you? Just, you're right there. I only say this because a graduate student of mine in his first job actually got his hand slapped by his district with him doing an assessment referral. Sorry for that background noise there. Apparently there is a rally going by me right now. And he was actually, what's the word? He was disciplined by his district because they didn't retain an O&M instructor, and they didn't want to have to retain an O&M instructor because he had identified a need and skills. So I just kind of share that as a cautionary tale. Now, to the things we will be doing as TSVIs, O&Ms, obviously that's your business. We'll talk about that a little more later. Independent living skills, there's no official assessment. The Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired has a set of booklets that are called Independent Living, and they have this great little white bound checklist that is age identified independence skills that are age appropriate. They involve self and home care. But going back to the family, a lot of this is going to be determined by that family structure, because if the family doesn't want them doing chores at home, maybe you can gently encourage it. But if they don't want them doing chores at home, then you're kind of doing mock skills within the classroom in a home ec environment. If they, the family wants them being really involved, you could potentially be really involved in creating adaptations to this. I remember an Amish student of mine that, they had a little workshop and did some production of different tools. And so they wanted her, she was very low functioning, but they wanted her to be able to sort two different kinds of components for what they were building, or they were like wood widgets of some sort. That became part of our tactile identification skills. So some of the other things can bleed in here. The real thing I want to caution everyone about is when it comes to independent living skills, and this also is part of social interaction, we really want to look around at what is age appropriate. This isn't necessarily true across all cultures and families of what is expected of children. My kids started cooking at age 3, and they've been active in prepping meals with our family since they're about 3 to 5. And we always joke my son had the sharpest knife in the house, because sharp knives are safe knives. But that wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't want to project that as a TSVI onto another family, right? Because they may not hold those same skills. So a certain level of cultural awareness and inquiry with the family can make a huge difference in those independent living skills. We also need to know what the end game is for some of our students. So there are some good tools. I like them from TSBVI just because it's a checklist, and I like being able to put little checks on pieces of paper that someone else has formalized, and there are blank lines, so you can write your own stuff in. But we do need to check in on independent living and identify if we're doing it or not, or there are needs in terms of the team. That brings us to social interaction, which is a really important one, in that too frequently, and again, Joe, I'll invite you to share in at the end right after I say this. Too frequently through my viewing, our students have really strong social interaction skills with adults. They have lots of teaching assistants, classroom assistants, people engaging them all over, but because the other students are at arm's length, and maybe they aren't always included in everything because of pullout and everything else, their social interaction skills with their peers are not as strong. So when we're looking at social interaction, we really need to both look at how they engage their teachers and adults, and people always say they seem really mature for their age, and the language they use in engaging us is really really adult-like, and people will be very enamored with that about our students, and that will often obfuscate the fact that they don't have the peer interaction skills that are going to be the basis for all of their social context for communication and relating to people the minute they get out of school. And so we really need to look at that peer interaction too.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I have been around adult clients that, if they have been blind their whole lives, I can almost tell if they have been interacting with mostly adults or with their peers based on their interactions with me. A lot of times, a totally blind student is placed with a classroom aide, and the aide does everything. They become the peer for working on a project, and their peer on the playground, and their peer at lunch, and all of those kind of things. And then very often, because of the familial aspect of that interaction, that kid gets away with things that other kids wouldn't be able to get away with. The outbursts of, shouting or whatever the case may be. And, I tell everybody this, and this is a broader understanding, but it's the context. My job is to create students that are competent and confident adults. They're going to learn the braille, they're going to learn the assistive technology, they're going to learn orientation and mobility. But what's really going to get them a job is their ability to demonstrate that they are just as competent and confident as any of their typically sighted peers. And that's why there is the whole aspect of the ECC. We're looking at a broad base of skills that students have in order to matriculate out of high school. Some will go to college, develop skills, become professionals in their field, and it will be because they had full exposure to all of these different domains of instruction. And social interaction is one of the most important, because not every student is going to be a great O&M traveler or great at computers or great at braille reading, but they all need to communicate with somebody else, and we want to make sure that those skills are very good.
And I want to kind of hit on the other end of it too, that all of those skills that in a, say, 9-year-old that seem very mature and adult-like in terms of language and politeness and engagement, although, yes, as a society, we completely value those skills in a polite society, when you see that same practice behavior of interacting socially in a 28-year-old, it feels different.
Yes,
And if
absolutely.
it feels different to you, then that means that impression is going to exist on every social interaction they have. And so you may not always be able to put your finger on it. But just be cautious of that thing that it feels different. And, if you need assistance in this area with assessment, social interaction, a lot of schools have, social groups. They will have, school counselors that lead these things. This isn't something we need to move in completely independently. And in fact, at least 2 schools I taught at, they've started a social interaction group for special education students at my request, because I'm like, I need something. Like, my students doing great, but I need more, and this isn't my specialty. I need someone else on the team. So it doesn't have to sit all in your basket, because we are those teachers that are always around them. I'm not saying we're the problem, but we may not be able to be the solution. And that's important to understand sometimes too, is that when we do these assessments, we may have identified that we need help. So I want to move into the last area here, which is self-actualization. That because self-determination was taken, it's taking all of that to the next level up. And so the important thing, rec and leisure, in terms of assessments, we can look at school sports, PE engagement, family activities, the child's personal interests, whether they be physical, intellectual, social, movies, radio, story, whatever. If you do not have some form of recreation or leisure activity, something that you do to release your mind, to relax your body and everything else, even if it is hard labor, like, for me, going out and chainsawing a tree is an amazing leisure activity for me. It's hard work, but boy, feel really good afterwards. You got to have something. You never know what it is, but we really need to have them exploring things. That's what school's all about, and we need to be cautious. So we have to have opportunities to assess within these environments and kind of look at them. Or if we get to a rec and leisure area in an EC assessment and we're like, student always pulls out in PE, not really interested in sports, not very physically active. Family watches a lot of TV at home, and yeah, all right, we might have a problem. Like we may need that. That is a big flag that there needs to be implicit instruction in rec and leisure. That there needs to be some engagement there. The student runs track, runs cross country, trains in the off season, volunteers at church, and is involved in volunteer activities within the Braille group. All right, that kid's good. Again, though, you never know what it's going to look like. A lot of those rec and leisure activities do, though, lead into career education. So what are the enjoyable tasks? What are their personal interests? Are there things that they have strong skill sets in? Thankfully, a lot of schools have career inventories, especially when they get in the higher grades. But at the lower grades, this stuff's really simple. Do they have things they like? And are they hearing, that's really cool that you're good at that. Who's also good at that? This profession. I'm doing this with 20-somethings at my wife's summer camp where they're acknowledging a skill, and I'm like, hey, you're really good at that. Did you know there's a career field? And these are kids that are in college, and they're going, no, actually, I didn't. Like, hey, you might want to look that up. Like, you're good at that. You can make a living. And that brings us to the last piece, and sort of all of these skills in this final self-actualization area go together in that self-determination. So what are your preferences, your dislikes? Are you willing to express a preference or a dislike for something and acknowledge that publicly? Tell someone that, you know what, you keep doing this. I really don't need that, which may be a thing in the schools, right? If people are constantly helping them, and I really don't need you to help me with that. I'm good. Or I really don't want to do that activity that we've been doing for the last 8 years. I really prefer to do something else. That ability to voice up and make those choices comes from the knowledge of choices, but then the willingness to, speak on them. And, we can get that by just looking at the child's options and whether or not they choose to take them. Like, where are they making those choices? Which can sometimes be hard with kids. We look at options, and sometimes they're parent determined, school determined, everything. So much of our child's lives are determined one way or another. And it's even worse for students with visual impairments because of all of the extra skills and abilities they have to know to be like on a level playing field. But there are little determinations in there that are always happening. So, anything to add on that, Joe?
I just wanted to talk about just the evaluation process here. As we said in the beginning, the ECC is not a required assessment, but it is best practices. And who determines if it should go on the eligibility chart when you're doing that is you as the TSVI. So you can introduce the concept of doing the ECC assessment at any time. I tend to like to do these around the age of middle school because the kid has gotten most of their compensatory skills. They've gotten a lot of good orientation and mobility. They maybe have had a lot of exposure to assistive technology. But now, some of these other skills that have maybe been kind of, what we refer to as soft skills, they need to become more front and center. But you can certainly introduce it at any time. If you want to start working on some career skills at an earlier age, just because you see a child that has is inquisitive about career and all of that, then go ahead and do that. But you should feel free to just say, hey, I want to do an ECC assessment as part of the eligibility process or the 3-year re-eval process.
And you guys should all observe here through these areas that, this is really talking about that diagnostic teaching. Like, This is all information that you're going to be gathering over time. And then if you want to submit it either as a formal part of the IEP process or just have it on hand, we should constantly be kind of reflecting on this. And when we go into the breakout on ECC, we're going to get into nuts and bolts of it if we want to do it more formally. And that's what that's going to be. So kind of thinking about a new student transfers in, I need to get a lay of the land really, really quickly. But we're going to move into the own assessment area. I'm looking at our time. We're a little long, but I think we can do this.
Okay.
So I think we'll just trade back and forth, and I'll just start out here. The O&M assessment really is a performance-based assessment, and it has several areas that are the functional assessment, observational based. You're observing the student's actual skills. Can they accomplish things? And you want to assess in each of the domains that we will list in a moment. This is determined for eligibility, which means they are going to get services from an O&M instructor. There's going to be IEP goals. The O&M instructor is going to have a clear layout of lesson plans and really concrete, student can do this independently when I get there. The trick of it all is O&M cannot be provided as the only VI service. If they don't need anything else but they need O&M, there's a caveat in there. Joe, did you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, and the reason for that, as I understand it in conversations with people like Crystal Patrick, is, there is such a thing as travel training, and that is people that are like O&M specialists, but they work with kids with other disabilities like Down syndrome and teach them how to travel. And what they're trying to do is define it in such a way that an O&M specialist is not called upon to do travel training. So that's why I put that in there. I had a situation like this recently where an O&M specialist had qualified the student without even an I report. It was based on his own observation, and the student was not receiving any other services, and the amount of O&M instruction that was being recommended was just exorbitant. And because I believe in going through the right process, which is what we're talking about, I said I need to see a copy of the I report, and that led to doing a new functional vision evaluation, and it was determined that the child was not eligible for VI services and therefore did not need orientation and mobility. And I just want to go back to one other thing. I put in parentheses for services. We don't use the O&M assessment to determine eligibility as part of the overall eligibility process. That really is the functional vision evaluation and the learning media assessment. But if you are doing those and it is recommended that you do the O&M assessment, you're going to be looking for the eligibility for services. There are some VI kids that get VI services, but they don't need orientation and mobility. One other thing I wanted to point out here is when it comes to the functional assessment, many of the same components of an FVA are being done. You're looking at distance acuity, you're looking at near acuity, but you're doing them in an environment that is conducive to movement. And you're looking at, perhaps having the student read a street sign at a distance of 10 feet, where now they have figure ground and visual complexity. I'm sure that Jennifer will go into that more in her, one-on-one about this. And then, let's see. Determining eligibility for O&M. Will the O&M increase safety, efficiency, or independence? Is the child's travel ability in alignment with peers who are the same age? Will O&M increase the quality of life, access to extracurricular activities, help transition to a new school, or increase involvement in community activities? I'm going to add one little piece here. When it comes to students with multiple disabilities, we need to consider the balance between their lack of autonomy. So I'm talking about students that are make use of a wheelchair, or they cannot travel independently. They always have to have somebody with them for medical reasons or behavior reasons. So we're balancing between their lack of autonomy and their need to be included in their movement to every extent possible. It's what I call partial participation. Not that I call it, that's what it's called. And I'll just give you a quick example. I had a young man about 10 years ago who was in a wheelchair. He was both deaf and blind. His brain consisted of brain stem, and we had a deaf-blind specialist come in to work with that student. And I thought, at first, wow, I don't know if this is going to be really beneficial for the student. But the deaf-blind specialist took the time to take this child around the school, and she took and put his hand on, like, it was a marble windowsill, and it was that time of year where that was cold, and she's like, do you feel the cold? That's the window. And then she had him close to where the heat vents were coming out, and there's the heat, and now we're in this place, and now we're in that place. And it was really profound to me because she was giving the student the dignity of not having everything just done to him, but having him participate in his own mobility. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about an O&M assessment for students that are pretty significantly impaired.
And
You want to add to that?
I think we're going to have the technology exists, especially for those students. People just haven't put it together yet for an even increase of that, where a student could literally, push a button on their iPad, it communicates to their wheelchair, and it takes them to the next class. And they're
cool.
Like, this technology, all of the components of it, like if we can get a Roomba to clean our house, if we can get autonomous vehicles to drive on the road, there's a higher level in the near future. It'll probably be 5 or 10 before it gets to us. Sure. But it's going to be something, there's going to be a changing definition out here. I really want to tag that, will O&M increase quality of life? Because as an O&M, that was constantly my challenge is, will this give the student just a little more independence, a little less dependence upon others? Will this just get them a quarter step to that next piece of, fully acknowledged sort of independence or self-determination? It really, O&M feeds into self-determination in a huge way, because if you can't make your choices to get around, it's really hard to be, self-determined in a lot of tasks. So some of the necessary background information that Joe had spoken about, what, visual condition. We want to know about use of low vision devices. Low vision devices are a huge component in a lot of my practice with monocular telescopes, or being able to read signage in the environment or what have you. Any medical conditions or medications are really important, in that you are not in the secured environment of a school when you provide O&M services. It's you and them out on a street corner or walking around the neighborhood. There's an increased amount of sort of personal responsibility, and as a result, exposure that happens, that we want to make sure we have that information. It's definitely also true for the TSVI within the school, but the O&M will take an additional, hopefully, level of precaution and accountability with knowing that information and knowing it well. We want to know if there's any form of hearing loss. Hearing loss is really important when it comes to environmental information. Is there some form of communication system that's going to determine social interactions in the environment? A lot of O&M skills determine your ability to either solicit information, confirm information, check with the bus driver you're on the right bus, all kinds of stuff. And then we get into, do they already know how to use a cane or an AMD? Have they had prior O&M training? Are there other related service personnel that are involved with the student, so that we can be a collaborative partner? As an O&M, our engagement with the student within the environment is going to be one piece, always one piece of a greater service delivery. And as a result, we want to know who else is playing along, because those people can provide us with data and information to make our services better. So you start that connection at a good early stage. Which means, as TSVI, the O&M is going to be like, hey, have you seen this? be aware of that. Did you want to go on the assessment domains, Joe?
Yes, sorry. Okay, so the assessment domains are mobility, and we're looking at gait, posture, balance. If they are using a cane, their cane skills and safety. That is where that whole question of medical concerns and medicine come in, because they can affect gait and balance in particular, or if they have a some kind of orthopedic issue that might affect posture. Their sensory skills, their ability to use sensory information to perceive and experience the world. That's where the auditory information comes in, the tactile information comes in. Orientation. Can they get from point A to point B? Even if they can't get there independently, can they describe it to you? I know that I step out of my classroom and I turn left and I go down to the end of the hall and then turn right and I find the office. So we're checking for their mental mapping skills. If they've been exposed to the understanding of cardinal directions, do they know it? As I said a moment ago, can they describe a route? Do they use landmarks naturally? I've found that kids with low vision, they make some of their own accommodations, including using landmarks. So we want to know. It's like, okay, well, what do you notice? Well, I noticed there's that, big blue wall. And once I get past that big blue wall, I know I turn left and that's where the gym is. Okay, they've already made a landmark for themselves. Concepts. Do they understand environmental concepts as they relate to independent travel? Do they understand that, when you're walking on a sidewalk, that there is space between the sidewalk and the street, if there's a tree lawn? Do they understand the concept of a city block? Do they understand that in older neighborhoods there might be more broken up concrete because of old trees and all of those kind of things? That's all environmental concepts that you want to see if they understand.
And I want to kind of just jump in there for a moment to, remind people that your brain does all of this based upon visual information. That's the way we're hardwired. And a lot of this information is knowing about the world beyond arm's reach. Great book, right?
Yep.
And it's about understanding that world beyond arm's reach. And the only way you build those concepts and maps and everything else is with repetition. So if you're taking on a new student, more often than not, unless the family's just gonzo and they've read all the books they need to about helping their student be independent, helping their child be, successful in O&M and all of that, there's going to be a lot of conceptual building. So we need to get a good framework on what the individual knows about that is beyond arm's reach. Because it's fine knowing how to get to a point in terms of your orientation skills, but if you don't know what's off that route by one step, you're going to get lost real quick. So you need to know what is beyond your route in every possible way a little bit so that you will understand how to get back where you need to be. And again, those are a little more complex. And if you've always been taken exactly where you need to go, you're going to need to expose that. But we'll get more into that in the next session. Sort of looking at our time, and we have one wrap up. It is the infamous ECAT slide. And I say that a little tongue in cheek, depending on whether or not people have been paying attention to some of the changes in ECATs. It's really important to understand that within this university program, I don't have access to ECATs. And so when you go into a student teaching environment, you're really going to have to learn this system quickly and well. And then when you get on the job, you're going to get even more immersed in it, but now you're in charge. So it's important for us to flag what's required in ECATs. And Joe already did a good job of talking about the instruction and availability of braille. We want to have that service of direct instruction, which is informed by the ECC. Doing that expanded core curriculum assessment is going to tell us what sort of direct instruction we need and in what areas of the expanded core curriculum. Mind you, I'm only talking about you as a vision professional's direct instruction, not other people's, because that's, again, that's their business. We're talking about how our process and engagement is going to be informed through collaboration and improved. And if it's somebody else's gig and they're going to write a goal on it, and it's appropriate for that to be one of their goals, as we've sort of detailed, cool. There's going to be areas within the assistive technology there. If it's a vision tech, it's all you, one way or another, and that goes for O&Ms as well. There is vision specific orientation mobility technology that's your domain, and nobody else should really be poking in on that, because using an orientation support system in a neighborhood is not something a TSVI should be going out and doing. And then all of the accommodations, which again are informed by the FEA LMA by determining preferred media, how the student is using their senses, and what compensatory skills for access they have. Couple points on that. Did you want to cover those, Joe?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
We can go over them. I'll go over them more when I get into the FEA LMA part.
Yep. Two little things or three little things I just want to say is our personal notes and reports will and should have more information than ECATS requires, right?
Yes.
ECATS is there for eligibility and for us to be really detailed about what's going to be provided and why. Our notes will have a whole bunch of extra information. When you're writing your reports and you're reporting to an IEP team, don't overload the team with all of our concern details. Everyone doesn't necessarily want to know every minute detail or what we did or did. They want to know the critical, important information that's going to lead to services and instruction. And we really want to keep our language non-technical. The last thing we ever want to do is sound like a doctor. Do we know that language? Yeah, we all took our eye anatomy course. We could all tango in that field. But the parents may not be able to, the math teacher may not be able to, and as a result, we want the information shared in an IEP to be as like common language, clear and personable as possible when we get there. So what we will cover, did you have some, or was that my echo?
Yeah, I just wanted to tag in very quickly on that. I was taught 2002, 2003 that a functional vision evaluation should be no more than 2 to 3 pages. Other professionals might like to go a little longer, but typically people really only want to know, like, how does this affect the student, and what does this mean for eligibility and all of that, and you really should be able to get that done in 2 to 3 pages. And I'll go more into the issue of non-technical language in the FEA LMA workshop.
And my professional habit is my assessment ends up being about 2 or 3 pages, but then I write a summary report that is never more than a page. Right. I just drill it down until it's just a critical features page, recommendations, done. So that everyone doesn't pick it up and go, oh dear God. The full FEA is in my file. And if they want it attached to the IEP, I give it to them, but I ain't handing that bad boy out, because yeah. So where we're going to go from here, we will have sessions next Saturday. I posted out an email to people. We're going to talk about these individual assessments, and we're going to now drill down. How do you actually assess that? What is a test you might use? How would you evaluate this element? We're going to get into, if you had just 1 hour to assess a student. I know it's an artificially short period of time, but if you just had 1 hour to assess in a student, what would you be able to get done and get out of there? Kind of think of it as your first hour of assessment, because that's what's going to be there. And from there, you're going to want to inquire about additional things. But what can you screen, scan? How close can you get to a full eligibility determination in some of these areas with just an hour of time? And how would you use that time to identify some of the areas we've outlined here? That's what we're going to go into next Saturday. The current plan, as you may have seen in the email, is for sometime in the fall, we're going to set up an assessment day. That is my task, and I am determined to make this work, to get some students who are volunteer, and for you to have that artificial 1 hour assessment time to engage it, so that we will get some more time with students. Because of COVID and all the restrictions, we just haven't had enough in-school time for some of you moving out into student teaching. So it'll provide some additional assessment opportunity. For those of you moving through program, it'll give you even more immersive engagement. So we went a little longer than we expected, but I think it's all very valuable information. And I only have a minor amount of editing to do. So we'll see you guys next time.